Okay. The 1980s was a time of political change and revolution in South Korea, as students and everyday citizens alike rose up against the military regime of Joon-hwan. Growing up in the United States, I never would have even known there was a military regime, let alone an uprising, had I not been born mixed Korean, as there was no mention of it ever in any of my history classes, and the only reason why I ever knew about it was because my grandfather would tell me stories about what had transpired there. However, since the time of democratization in South Korea, several films have been released documenting the individuals who helped the nation rise up against the tyranny of the government at the time, such as Joon-hwan's 1987 When the Day Comes, which focuses on the cover-up of the torture and killing of a student activist, which prompted the June Democratic Uprising, as well as Jang-hoon's A Taxi Driver, which brings to light the efforts of a taxi driver and German journalist who helped spread the news of the Gwangju Uprising and how the government was killing the activists to the rest of the world. Both of these films in fact were released in 2017, so within the last 5 years at the time of this video being uploaded. Films such as these are vital to the stories of these people who fought so hard and sacrificed so much for their country and fellow Koreans, and the fact that this period of history is not discussed all that much in the West only further solidifies the importance of these films. The goal of this video is not only to make connections between these two films, but to express the importance of them and others like them in telling the Korean story, that which isn't really taught in the rest of the world. My hopes for this video are that either 1. People watch these films to learn more about South Korea and its history, or 2. Something can be changed in order for there to be more taught about Korea within the American education system. Sadly, although I would like for my audience to definitely check out these films, as they are both amazing and I enjoyed both of them very much, I'll have to give a spoiler warning as I'm going to be dissecting the films in this video. So with that warning out of the way, let us begin. To start this video off, I would like to give some historical context to both of the films. Following Park Chung-hee's assassination on October 26, 1979, Joon-hwan would become the new military dictator of South Korea. Beginning May 18, 1980 at Cheonnam National University, civilians and students in the city of Gwangju would begin peacefully protesting the martial law Joon-hwan had put into place, only to be, to quote my Korean film professor, fired upon, killed, raped, and beaten by Joon-hwan's armed troops who were sent in to squash the demonstrations. Joon-hwan had the approval of the United States to deploy these troops to crush the protesters, and the reported death toll of civilians was nearly 200. However, some sources claim the toll to be more near 1,500 to 2,000, the total number of casualties being 5,189. The city would be blockaded, making news about what was happening nearly impossible to get out, not only to other parts of the country, but to the entire world. This is where the movie A Taxi Driver comes in, focusing on the taxi driver Kim Man-sob, played by Song Kang-ho, and the German journalist Jürgen Hinspeter, played by Thomas Kretschmann. This film tells the story of how these two managed to get the news out of Gwangju and to the rest of the world. On the other hand, 1987 When the Day Comes is set 7 years after the events of A Taxi Driver, during the June Democratic Uprising, a nationwide struggle that sought to protest against Joon-hwan's military regime, which really sparked following the death of the student activist Park Jong-chul from waterboarding torture during interrogation by the anti-communist branch of the Korean National Security. Jang, the chief interrogator of the operation, infamously told the press, "When I slammed the table, he just dropped dead." Following his death, the public was in outrage, with there being nearly 1 million protesters nationwide, and not only were there just students and working-class citizens protesting this time. Best stayed by Kyung and Hwang, the students and workers had been a given for many years, but in June they were joined by increasing numbers of white-collar workers representing the burgeoning middle class. These soon swelled the ranks of the protesters to upwards of 1 million people throughout the country. The film 1987 is a political thriller that focuses on this, following several characters including the interrogators involved in the killing of Park Jong-chul, as well as the student activist from Yonsei University, Yi Han-yol, played by Kang Dong-hwan, who was struck by a police tear gas canister during a demonstration and sadly never regained consciousness. However, the image of his body being dragged by a fellow protester would become a symbol for activists, and over 1 million people would attend his funeral on July 9, 1987, becoming one of the largest events in Korean political history. I would mention the other characters of this film, but there are so many, and regarding the actual history involved in this film, I figured these were probably the most relevant. Although these films focus on very different aspects and events during the rule of Joon-hwan and the protests against him, I found interesting narrative connections that I could make between the two. First and foremost, the obvious connection someone can make is the focus on the use of military and police brutality against the activists of both movements, and the culture of students and workers protesting against the government, best characterized by the Minjung movement of the 1980s, a political movement which focused on anti-colonialism and pro-democratization and nationalism in South Korea. We can find this in A Taxi Driver, especially in the scene starting at 4725, where Kim Man-sob is driving through the masses of protesters while Yogan Hinspita films the scene, showcasing the youth and elderly alike walking together, and later on we see people performing traditional song and dance, which is a huge prominent feature of Minjung culture. Oddly enough, another prominent connection I made between these films was their use of shoe symbolism. In A Taxi Driver, we are first introduced to this through Kim Man-sob's daughter, who was pestered at first by her father for stepping on and folding the backs of her shoes, only to explain to him that those shoes are too small. This helps to establish the impoverished state of most likely not only Kim Man-sob, but of many of the South Koreans who were in similar circumstances to him at this time. We later on see this shoe symbolism pop up again in the film as Kim attempts to drive home from Gwangju, leaving behind Hinspita, stopping in a town along the way to pick up a new pair of shoes for his daughter. Finally, we see this again when Kim returns to Gwangju to find Gu Jae-sik, played by Ryo Jun-yol, the young college student and activist who acted as an English translator for Kim and Hinspita, lying dead on the hospital floor. On the other hand, we are first introduced to this element of symbolism in 1987, in the first interaction between Yi Han-yol and the main female lead Yeon-hee, played by Kim Dae-ri, where Han-yol saves Yeon-hee from the plain-clothed anti-protester police as they miscategorize her for the other protesters, and during their escape, Han-yol manages to lose a shoe. Most likely to thank him for saving her, Yeon-hee buys him a new pair of shoes from the local shop that helped them hide from the police. Later on in the film, Yeon-hee is kidnapped by the police after an encounter where her mother began demanding for Yeon-hee's uncle to be released from the anti-communist branch of the Korean Security Agency's headquarters, where he was being interrogated and tortured. After being dragged away from the scene and split from her mother by the police, Yeon-hee is dumped in the middle of the countryside and calls Han-yol to help her. Much like him in their first encounter together, she is missing a shoe, and he arrives on the scene with a new pair of shoes for her, repaying her for earlier. Finally, we see this again when Yi Han-yol is killed by the police and being dragged away from the scene, where we can see him missing another shoe. I found this attention to shoes in both films to be intriguing, and honestly not the connection I initially thought I would make, but it makes sense, especially with the context of both films. In both movies, I found the shoes to be representative of the footing and mobility the characters had. In A Taxi Driver, Kim Man-sob's daughter initially brings to light this symbol, as she destroys her shoes due to them being too small for her, being an acting reason for Kim to get paid to buy her a new pair of shoes, eventually leading him to Gwangju. And when Kim is faced with the now passed body of Jae-sik, he puts his shoe back on him. With Jae-sik obviously not being able to move any longer, the shoe being put back on him is likely used to show how he can still have footing and continue to act in spirit. In the case of 1987, this obviously serves to connect the two characters of Yeon-hee and Yi Han-yol, but like A Taxi Driver, I also found it as a means to move and act. Yi Han-yol initially needs a new pair of shoes or else he will be targeted as an activist and likely arrested by the police, which would in turn prevent him from protesting anymore, prompting Yeon-hee to buy him a new pair. When Yeon-hee is left out in the middle of nowhere, she's stuck there until Han-yol comes to her rescue with a new pair of shoes. Finally, when Han-yol is killed by the tear gas canister at the end of the film, the missing shoe can again symbolize the inability to keep moving, much like Jae-sik in the other film. Personally, I found this to be a very interesting use of imagery and a distinct connection that I made between the two films that I couldn't leave out when discussing them for this video. Both films focus on these tumultuous times for South Korea as innocents massed against the autocratic and oppressive regime of Joon-hwan. It is a story about revolution against tyranny, characterized by the blood shed by the student and worker activists who gave their lives in order to democratize the Republic of Korea. Again, as a Korean American, I was lucky enough to learn about these events from my grandfather, who had me watch films like these and who would tell me stories about what happened and what it was like growing up during that time. But it always baffled me how I would never hear about any of this while I was in school. Maybe it was because of the anti-American sentiment held by many of the Minjung activists during that time, or maybe the American connection and approval of Joon-hwan's actions, but I always couldn't help but wonder why we seem to avoid talking about this period of Korea's history, or honestly Korean history as a whole. Which is why I believe films like these two are vital in telling this part of history, which is often overshadowed by others. Without films like 1987, When the Day Comes, and A Taxi Driver, people who didn't experience the events which occurred can easily forget about what happened, and we cannot allow this to happen. These films depict the struggle and revolution of millions, and can easily be compared to other revolutions seen in other parts of the world around the same time, and are not only important to the story of South Korea, but the story of the whole world. I hope by watching this video you were able to gain an interest in either one of these films, and hopefully an interest in Korean history as well. It is my first time making a video essay like this, so it was likely rough around the edges, but nonetheless I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. I would also like to give a special thank you to my film and Korean culture professor Dr. Oh for dealing with all of my personal antics throughout the semester. I know it was probably stressful to put up with, and I deeply apologize for it, but I just want you to know that I genuinely appreciate your support. In all honesty, I loved everything about this class, and it was truly special to have the opportunity to be a part of it. If I were to pick a favorite film, it would probably be House of Hummingbird, as that movie really resonated with me. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me your thoughts on either the video or the films discussed. Also, any feedback would be greatly appreciated. I'm currently in the works of making another video essay focusing on the animated film series KREN no Kyokai, The Garden of Sinners, so any criticism that helps me to get better is great. Thanks again for watching my video.